And so I think we've reached a point, where, the easy communications on conservation and the environment are kind of behind us. We've had this great victory. We've really put it on the agenda, and we've won a lot of specific wins. But I think in some ways you could see these as treating really the symptoms rather than getting to the underlying challenges. And if we are going to deal with the serious planet crunch, which is now there in the science, we're going to have to deal with the communications in a slightly different way, because once in the 80s and 90s, when it was possible to talk about banning chemicals or regulating particular industrial sectors, those days are behind us. If we are going to be serious about addressing consumption patterns, that in turn is about behaviour. It certainly is about government, and it certainly is about companies, but it's about changing the expectations of people and being able to communicate a different set of values about how we want to live, as was evidently coming out last year. So I spent, most of my career working for very specific changes and been involved in a lot of the campaigns that have led to different legislation, including the Climate Change Act last year. But I do think we are now moving into a different phase. We've kind of won phase one, where the issues have been accepted. The science now is a consensual thing in the political community and crucially in the corporate community. But in terms of moving on to the next step, how we're going to embed these global challenges in personal change really is, I think, the name of the game. Now, to some extent, we're making progress on this already. It's not as if we've not been moving into this space. And I think if you look at the climate change issue in particular, you can see how it's possible to accelerate a really big challenge from the margins of society into the mainstream very quickly. And that's what's happened since 2004. It was like that. 5 years, we've gone from this being a marginal debate amongst the scientific community, where you get mad people on the BBC saying it's not happening, through to it being something which is now framing how business is strategizing, what governments are doing, and indeed, the international summits that are coming forward. But I think it's important to understand the difference, perhaps, between the climate issue and some of these more complicated, in some ways, challenges linked to biodiversity. The climate thing, it's actually quite straightforward in terms of the impacts. You can take the value of why we want the stable climate just by looking at the implications of sea level rise and the effects of extreme conditions. People can get that fairly quickly. The other thing about the climate issue, which makes it something that can engage the public very quickly, is the fact that we're all involved. Everybody can relate to this by turning off a light, thinking about how they fly, talking about their diet and how much meat they're eating, whether they're going to buy an efficient car or a gas guzzler, or where they're going to go on holiday. It becomes part of a popular discourse very, very quickly. People can buy into it at a personal level. And so that global challenge becomes something that people can relate to in that sense. And also, it's a very rational subject, climate change, in many ways. You can talk about it in terms of tons of carbon, parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, percentages of reduction paths we have to get on board with. And all of that, of course, has made it something that can be debated in an understandable sense in the news and elsewhere. The other thing about the climate issue, which is hugely important and which we mustn't underestimate, is how it's now a political story. And so, President Obama, the Chinese, Gordon Brown are all talking about this thing, which means it gets covered by different correspondents, which puts it into a completely different place in the newspaper and on the news. And all of that stuff, I think, is why climate is now up there as the big defining environmental challenge. Of course, what's happened as we've now got this carbon obsession is that the thing that many of us started this great conservation journey for, i.e. the biodiversity, has got completely lost. And if we're going to bring that back onto the agenda, we have to think carefully about how we're going to relocate biodiversity into the new context of this global strategic challenge, and how we're going to make this a personal thing that people can relate to. And the biodiversity thing is actually quite complicated. Even though it's all around us, paradoxically, people still don't get it. It's not like switching the light on or off when you see a blackbird. You don't have the same kind of reaction in terms of seeing this as an environmental kind of linkage that you're involved in. And so we have to, I think, understand that and realise that even though biodiversity is everywhere near us, paradoxically, it's actually quite a distant phenomenon for most people. And actually, if you look at the use of that word, the B word, and look at some of the surveys that the conservation groups have done, people really don't get it. They don't understand what it is. They don't understand the implications of a mass extinction, or indeed why it should be of concern to them. And I think that's something that is a big challenge for us. Now, certainly we should talk about biodiversity in a rational way, as we have done about climate change. And the numbers come in, and things like the Stern Review help us to frame the economics. And there's a load of really good stuff going on, which is helping the biodiversity and the natural world issues lift up more into that space where climate change is now at. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, for example, the work of the investigation on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity is the thing based up in Cambridge, doing really fantastic work in helping us understand some of the numbers and the implications of allowing the continuing degradation of the natural world. But it isn't connecting. It's not getting into the popular consciousness in a way which is changing behaviour. And I think, we have to really get down to some of the ways in which we might navigate past this. And I think one of the things that is important to recognise now is how, the intellectual stuff is going to connect with people only to a certain level. But if their basic underlying values and connections to nature aren't there, they just simply don't get it. And I think that is the nature of the problem we now have, because that great acceleration I talked about and this rise of expectations of consumers worldwide has been accompanied by a very rapid, in any historical sense, separation from nature. Most people now really have very little direct experience of growth, of soils, of wildlife, of the cycles of nature. And as a result of that, they have very few emotional, or dare I say it, spiritual anchors to bring them into any kind of contact with issues in ways that's going to help them change their values. And if they don't change their values and begin to accept different ways of living, then I fear we're not going to get past this. This is in part a political problem, of course, because, we all know that people on their own aren't going to solve this by changing their behaviour. We do need governments to be involved as well in setting the frameworks. But governments in democracies, of course, only do things that's going to get them re-elected. And in terms of making the kinds of steps that are going to reduce consumption through ecological taxes, through restrictions on personal freedoms, they're not going to do it until we all say it's okay to do it. And I don't think we're going to say it's okay to do it until we have a more emotional and spiritual connection with nature. Now, that is a huge communications challenge, because we've all got used over the years, for very good reason, for winning specific campaigns to ban that chemical, to reduce that pollution, have some targets and timetables. Absolutely wonderful, but I do think we're reaching the limits of where that will now take us, and a new strategy is required to take us into a different place. It also needs to be underpinned by a new kind of economics, and this is a bit of a policy wonky thing, but I do think the conservation community needs to get its head round how we can measure the performance of societies differently. At the moment, we're obsessed with GDP growth. I don't know how many times you would have heard on the news this morning about the economic recovery. I heard at least 4 different news items telling us how we can expect 1 or 2% growth next year. Is that a good thing? Putting the 20th century economy back on track, I don't think is going to be a good thing if it's going to lead to those curves going even more steeply upwards in terms of demand for resources and all the rest of it. So we have to get a new economics in there, and I think in some ways, that's the cutting edge of the policy agenda for me, alongside the changing culture which can help that economics to live through a new kind of politics. I hope that makes sense in terms of how our communications can be shaping a different context for change going forward. So, just by way of summary, I think we've moved into a new space. We've won lots of arguments and we've achieved a lot of change. But I think if we don't lift our game and if we don't reconnect people back into understanding nature at an emotional and spiritual level as well as an intellectual one, we may continue to win particular battles, but I fear that we won't win the war. Thank you very much.